Hey everyone, this is Adam. Happy New Year. In a few weeks, we're going to be coming back at you with the next episode in our 6th season. But in the meantime, we have something really delightful to share with you. Over the all too brief holiday season, we were feasting our ears on one of our favorite shows. It's called Threshold, and they've just released a new season, Hark, that is all about sound in the more than human world. So far, we've been treated to sounds from the primordial stew, fishy sounds emitted by plants, and the sounds of insects. But the episode that we're going to share today is about the sounds of coral reefs, what we can learn from them, and how they might help us restore healthy reefs in a warming ocean. So, without further ado, here's Emergency Services from Threshold's 5th season, Hark. Enjoy.
In the beginning, it was quiet. There were currents and waves, downpours, fractures, eruptions. And eventually, the burble of oxygen being released by communities of microbes in the sea. But it took almost 4 billion years for the first complex life forms to emerge on Earth. They were soft-bodied things: jellies, sponges, sea anemones, and corals. None of them were big talkers. Last time, we met Earth's first conversationalists, fish. But as they began to fill the seas with their croaks and honks and growls, corals were already there, silently building reefs, places for the fish and now many other animals to call home.
Coral reefs are some of the world's most diverse and special and beautiful and unique ecosystems.
Welcome to Threshold. I'm Amy Martin, and this is Dr. Tim Lamet, one of the world's leading experts in coral reef acoustics.
I study coral reefs, their degradation, and more positively, efforts we can make to restore them.
There are few habitats on our planet more wondrous than coral reefs, or more endangered. They're marine metropolises, underwater fountains of biodiversity, and they're in big trouble. You've probably heard about how rising ocean temperatures are starving and killing the coral, leaving many reefs bleached and broken. But what might be less well known is how important sound is in the coral reef story.
When reefs are degraded, you can hear it happening. They go silent. And when reefs recover or when reefs are restored, you can hear the noise coming back.
Even though corals themselves are very quiet beings, through the communities they create, they are speaking. And if we can learn how to listen, we might have a chance of getting them through this time of crisis. It's just before sunrise, and I'm standing on a beach in Coral Bay, Western Australia, looking out toward Ningaloo Reef. The reef itself is hidden beneath the waves, but I can still see its protective power, the way it absorbs the relentless force of the ocean crashing against it, leaving a buffer zone of calmer water close to shore.
What you see from shore is a white line where waves are breaking, pretty much as far as the eye can see out there.
Ningaloo Reef stretches 260 kilometers, or around 160 miles end to end, and later I'm going to take a boat out to it and go snorkeling. And I can't wait to see it up close, because it boggles my mind that something this big and tough could be made by an animal as small and soft as a boiled pea.
They're an ecosystem that is unique in the sense that it's made by an animal. It's got an animal right at the very base of it that constructs the whole habitat.
Again, that's marine biologist Tim Lammett. He's based at Lancaster University in the UK. In our first episode, we heard about how some microbes make rocks called stromatolites. Corals took that technology and leveled it up.
A coral is a tiny animal that forms these vast colonies, and these colonies create rock. They create and exude limestone skeletons beneath them, and those skeletons grow in tropical shallow waters and create these wonderful shapes and patterns and structures around which all sorts of other life congregates and lives and makes a home.
And corals actually provide housing inside their bodies too. Tiny algae called zooxanthellae live inside coral polyps. In exchange, they provide food and aesthetic services to the corals.
Corals themselves aren't colourful, it's the algae that lives inside them that give them their colour.
So corals are kind of animal, vegetable, and mineral all in one. Their lives are defined by togetherness, from the symbiotic relationship that sustains each individual polyp, all the way up to the enormous communities they build. Not all reefs are made by coral. They can be made of stone, sand, even the shells of oysters. But tropical coral reefs are the rainforests of the sea. They're bursting with life and sound.
Absolutely, there's loads of different sounds, and that makes sense because underwater sound travels so well. So if you're an animal that lives in the water, sound is a brilliant means by which to communicate, means by which to discover things about your environment around you.
This is the sound of a reef in Indonesia.
So the dominant sound you hear is this crackle, and that's actually the sound of snapping shrimp. They make that sound with their claws.
These claw clicks actually produce miniature shock waves that are strong enough to stun or even kill small fish.
What you're hearing is loads and loads and loads of individual claw clicks, which combine to make that static sound. And then punctuated through that, at different times of day, you'll hear different types of fish noises. And they're really quite varied as well. So there's buzzes and chatters and grunts and whoops and purrs, and some are high-pitched and some are low-pitched, some are really loud, some are quite quiet.
All of these sounds can tell us things about the health of the whole community. The sheer amount of sound and the diversity of it signals a thriving reef. And Tim and his colleagues are frequently stumped by what they hear underwater, just like Lauren Hawkins and Miles Parsons, who we met in our last episode.
Again and again, we find ourselves just shrugging our shoulders and going, no idea what makes that noise. Sometimes we joke that it's harder to think of anything we do know about coral reef sounds than thinking of stuff we don't know. And so it's a really exciting field to be involved with because, you know, the edge of knowledge is so close.
I'm on the boat now with a small group of other tourists, all of us looking pretty awkward in our wetsuits and fins.
So I'm heading out to Ningaloo Reef from Coral Bay. The sea is this unbelievable turquoise color.
The plan for the morning is to do 2 swims, one on either side of the reef.
And this is actually the first time I've ever gotten close to a reef. So I'm pretty excited.
Soon we were there, and it was time for me to stop recording, get my snorkel in my mouth, and jump in. Swimming through the coral jungles of Ningaloo was riveting. We started on the inland, protected side, where the water was relatively calm. Schools of brightly colored fish darted around me as I flutter-kicked over a dazzling array of coral fingers, blossoms, plates, and bulbs. It felt like swimming over a city made of flowers, inhabited by fairy tale creatures, sea turtles, stingrays, sea stars. I even spotted a small shark darting through the forest of living stone.
So many of your senses are just buzzing when you're underwater. You know, like what you can see, the shapes, the colours, the sense of busyness.
I felt like I'd walked through the back of the wardrobe and floated into a magical world. I saw animals that looked like plants and plants that looked like animals. If one of them had swum up to me and started talking, I wouldn't have been all that surprised. Anything seemed possible in this secret metropolis, hidden just beneath the surface of my ordinary, land-based existence. Later, we swam on the outer side of the reef, where the full force of the ocean crashes in and everything is loud and wild. I had to make sure the waves didn't throw me up against the coral. I could feel each swell growing, lifting me and the fish and anything else that wasn't anchored to the seabed up and up, pushing us toward the reef faster and faster, until the wave broke and we flowed back in the other direction, all of us utterly at the whim of the water. My arms and legs seemed awkward and fragile. I've never felt more admiring of the easy grace of fish. And when an enormous manta ray swam past me, stately and serene, I don't have words to describe how that felt.
It's staggering, isn't it? When I took my family to show them a coral reef, I took them to Ningaloo. It's so overwhelming some of the time. You know, there's all of this life and activity and colour and shape and sound all around you. And you're just there, like, floating in the middle of it all, like some, big clumsy oaf.
Exactly. Tropical coral reefs cover a tiny percentage of the seafloor, 0.1% to be exact, but they support the lives of at least a quarter of ocean species. From microscopic plankton to massive whale sharks, the life-giving power of reefs spirals up through the food chain and out in all directions, including up onto land and into our human lives. Billions of people across the globe depend on reefs for the seafood they nurture, the coastlines they protect, and the medicines they provide. The World Economic Forum estimates coral reefs are providing at least $10 trillion worth of services to humanity every year. But so much of what's precious about a reef can't be translated into money. All around the warm midline of our planet, people's lives are bound to reefs through food, language, stories, songs, and spirituality. And as Tim talks, it's evident how much these places mean to him, too.
And there's still a lot that we have yet to appreciate about these places as well. They're places where we have a very limited understanding of some aspects of reefs. We're discovering new things about coral reefs all the time. And to think of these places as being as vulnerable as they are is quite sobering. I find it really quite difficult to think about sometimes.
I find it quite difficult to think about too. But the fact is, coral reefs are gravely threatened, and we need to face this reality if we're going to do anything about it. So I asked him to give us a general outline on coral reef health, and he responds a bit like a physician giving a really tough diagnosis to a patient.
Coral reefs are facing more threats now than they have at any other point in human history. And we generally split them into what we call global threats and local threats. And so global threats are to do with climate change. And so they are coral bleaching, which is caused by extremes in temperature. More often than not, it's marine heat waves that cause the temperature of the water to rise. That causes a breakdown in the relationship between the algae that lives inside the coral and the coral itself. The algae is expelled and the coral can no longer photosynthesize, and often it will then starve and die a few weeks after that. Some marine heat waves are so intense that it's not the bleaching mechanism that kills the coral, it's just akin to heat exhaustion. The coral basically just cooks instantly. So heat is a big problem. Climate change is also causing a worsening of these tropical storms and cyclones. They're becoming more intense and more frequent, and so we're seeing storm damage go up. And then outside of climate change, in these local threats as well, we're seeing around the world increasing amounts of overfishing, of destructive fishing practices, of pollution. So there is a mixture of these big global climate change threats combined with these more localized threats from fishing and from pollution and from habitat destruction. And together, they paint a very bleak future for coral reefs. And it's not a future that is distant or is, something that we have a lot of time to work out how to deal with. It's a future that is becoming a grim reality very quickly.
Our oceans are heating up at an alarming rate. 2023 was the hottest year in the ocean on record, until this year, when they got even hotter. As we release this episode at the end of 2024, we're in the middle of the largest coral bleaching event ever documented. Every light on the ocean temperature dashboard is flashing red. The latest science indicates that if average global temperatures rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, more than 90% of coral reefs will be lost. And if we go past that to 2 degrees of warming, almost all of them will likely die. We're currently on track for 3 degrees of warming by the end of this century.
A reef has some natural resilience and is able to bounce back from some disturbance, and that's part of what a reef should be. It can't deal with the amount of disturbance we're throwing at it and the acceleration of the pressures that we're throwing at it as humanity at the moment.
These pressures change the soundscape of a reef, like a sonic fingerprint left at the scene of a crime. This is a healthy reef, full of color and bustling with the sounds of life. And here is a reef in peril, going pale and very quiet. How do you keep yourself sane? Like, you're obviously a person who cares about all of this, and you're right in the water watching really hard things happen. And as you said, it's not in the future, it's now. How are you managing just the emotional impact of dealing with all of this?
Sometimes it's difficult. That's the first thing to say is that I wouldn't say that I manage it particularly well all of the time. Sometimes I do find it very hard, and I find it a particular challenge of my job. But that said, lots of people have jobs where they work in difficult circumstances. People who work in healthcare, people who work in emergency services, fields of work where you have to learn how to face difficult stuff in your job and then come home and not let it ruin your life.
I think Tim does work in emergency services, just not in the way we typically define that term. And like any healthcare worker, he doesn't just want to document decline. He wants to try to keep coral reefs alive.
Personally, I try and work on solutions. So whether that's working to try and improve the feasibility of restoration, whether that's trying to work with people in power in businesses or in politics or in powerful social movements. And so I think it's a mixture of learning to deal with work in tough circumstances, which is something that a lot of people do, and also trying to alter the course of our work such that it is moving towards positive solutions rather than just describing depressing trends.
After seeing too many reefs go ghostly white and hearing them turn deadly quiet, Tim was determined to find ways to help. He knew reefs were incredibly dynamic places that can sometimes respond quickly to positive impacts, just like they do to negative ones.
The propensity these ecosystems have to change, I find, is really amazing.
And he began to wonder if he could use sound to help reefs ward off decline, or even come back from the dead.
It's this idea that by playing the right sounds, you can make places sound attractive to animals, and they'll then, alter their behaviour. You'll get increased settlement, increased immigration, if you like.
We'll have more after this short break. Welcome back to Threshold. I'm Amy Martin, and it's a November night. The moon is just past full, and the corals are spawning.
It's this amazing night to be out in the water, swimming around.
Marine biologist Tim Lammett has an idea for how sound could be used to help coral push back against all the threats they're facing. And to understand how it works, we have to start here, during a spawning event, when millions of tiny corals release their eggs and sperm into the water.
In many species, they all align, which is quite a magical thing. So on one night of the year, many of these broadcast spawners will all release their gametes all at the same time, and of course that maximises the chance that they meet in the water.
Tim says nobody knows for sure how the corals manage to coordinate this way. They just know that it happens.
You can see the tiny little egg bundles floating up into the water, and you can see the sperm being released. That creates such a buzz and activity around the reef because there's so many other animals that then also come out to feed on these eggs and the sperm, and it's chaos in the water. It's really loud, it's really busy, there's all sorts of stuff swimming around. It's going in your ears, it's going in your mask, it's going down your wetsuit. It's like, busiest night on the reef. It's like Saturday night city centre,
Amidst all of this ruckus, some of the eggs manage to get fertilized and survive, and eventually, a baby coral is born, small as a grain of sand, bobbing around in the open ocean.
And then they come back to the reef, swept on ocean currents, and settle. So these free-swimming coral planulae, as we call them before they've settle and become an adult coral polyp. And that's how you create a coral reef with millions and millions of those coral polyps.
It's called a biphasic life cycle. Birth and early development spent out in the open ocean, adulthood spent on the reef.
Corals have it, other invertebrates have it, even the fish have it. As an egg or as a very young juvenile, they'll be out at sea, and then there'll be this sort of journey back to the reef when the organism's ready to start its adult life. Animals arrive carried on ocean currents and settle in new places. Corals will settle and start to create habitat. Different types of algae will settle. Fishes will arrive, and you can get a community developing based on new arrivals from the open ocean, if you like.
Creating a healthy reef is a cooperative process, with interdependencies radiating out in all directions. The coral structures provide great hiding places for fish that are trying to hunt or avoid being hunted. The fish return the favor by peeing and pooping on the reef, providing nutrients that are crucial for the coral and the zooxanthellae inside of them. The fish also eat some other kinds of algae that would otherwise smother the coral. They kind of mow the lawn, clearing space for new coral polyps to settle. So healthy coral makes for healthier fish populations, which makes for healthier algae, which makes for healthier coral, and on and on. The fates of all the plants and animals here are tangled up together. So that's why listening to fish can help us understand what's happening with corals. Tim knew that sound was a part of this community building process, that young fish listen out for the symphony of pops, whoops, and gurgles of a thriving reef in deciding where to settle. But he wanted to know if that process could be hacked. When a reef was in decline, could he intervene acoustically and prevent it from going silent? Finding out meant becoming a reef DJ, pumping out tunes designed to get the party started.
When we first tried this, I was doing my PhD, so it was very low budget science. It was a lot of fun putting it all together. So the first experiment we did, we had these loudspeakers about the size of a dinner plate. They're sold as the loudspeakers that you would use to put in a swimming pool for synchronized swimming, so that the swimmers can hear the music, right?
I just instantly saw all these fish in a line.
Yeah. It's all very Little Mermaid, isn't it?
These speakers were connected to little floating barrels that held MP3 players,
which played one of our recordings of a really healthy sounding reef out of the loudspeaker.
The next step was to tie the speakers to little artificial patches of habitat made by Tim and his team.
Piles of rocks underwater, basically.
Then they pushed play and waited for someone to show up.
Repeatedly, each day we'd go back and visit these reefs and count the number of fish that had arrived, that had settled. You know, I'd go down with a clipboard and it was fun. It was like watching the establishment of a tiny little settlement underwater. Yeah, you know, you'd put your dive gear on, roll off the boat and go down and wonder, you know, who's moved in today. and we found that on the reefs where we were playing the healthy sounds, twice as many fish would move in. The community developed at twice the speed, and after 40 days, there was twice the abundance of fish.
In other words, it worked. Hearing the buzz of a party made more fish want to come in and hang out.
So if we play the sound of a healthy ecosystem, then that is a very attractive sound, and that literally calls in animals looking for somewhere to live.
Tim's research gave us a new tool in the reef restoration toolbox.
What we have is a short-term proof of concept experiment. In that location at that time, we were able to double fish abundance. There are a lot of other questions about whether that would work in different geographical contexts, on different reefs, over longer periods of time, over larger spatial scales. And we don't know the answers to that yet. There are exciting experiments and studies going on around the world to try and get those answers, and time will tell what the results of those experiments will be.
But what about the animals at the base of all this? The corals themselves? Is it possible that they could be encouraged to settle by playing the sounds of a healthy reef? On the face of it, this seems improbable. Corals have no ears or even brains. But Tim has learned not to make assumptions.
Corals, especially in their little larval stage, are constantly surprising us with what they can do.
And one of the intriguing things about the coral planulae, those free-floating newborn corals, is that they're covered in microscopic hairs.
And when you look at those hairs, they're actually relatively similar in structure to the hairs that are on the inside of our ears as mammals.
They're called cilia, and in humans, they play an essential role in hearing. They grow deep inside the ear, swaying and bending as sound waves hit them, and helping to translate that mechanical energy into chemical and electrical signals that can be processed by our brains. And the cilia on the bodies of baby corals seem to behave in very similar ways.
These hairs will vibrate in response to a passing sound wave, and when we've studied these coral planulae in labs, people have discovered that they will change their shape in response to the sound of a healthy reef. They'll change their shape to one that sinks in the water.
The research on this is still emerging, but it seems that when the sound of a lively reef is nearby, the planulae will morph into a shape that helps them sink down into the water, where they're more likely to find a good place to call home.
If you put them in a tube and you play the sound of a healthy reef from one end of that tube, they'll even start to swim down that tube towards the loudspeaker.
These tiny infant corals are somehow cueing in to the hubbub of a reef. It's like their bodies become ears, bobbing along in the ocean. 500 million years ago, long before anything was calling or crying or singing, these little beings may have been learning to listen. So, just to be clear about what we know and what we have yet to find out here, We know that baby corals definitely respond to reef sounds in the lab and inside containers anchored to the sea floor. Whether or not those planulae are using sound to find and settle on reefs when they're swimming freely in the wilds of the ocean is still an open question. But again, Tim has learned that these ancient creatures shouldn't be underestimated.
So there's some really quite amazing abilities of these, animals that initially appear to be very simple, but are able to respond to these complex acoustic cues in their environment around them.
New research on coral reef acoustics is coming out all the time, but so are new reports of dying reefs. We need legions of scientists like Tim, people who are willing to commit their lives to finding out everything we can about coral reefs and acting on that knowledge as quickly as possible. But scientists can only do so much. We're in a race against time, or more accurately, against ourselves. You are nurturing this extremely important habitat in this absolute time of crisis. Maybe if we can get some version of them through the next 30, 60, 150 years, then maybe there's a chance for them to get through this bottleneck. And do you see yourself that way, as like a coral shepherd moving them through a bottleneck?
That, I guess, is where this comes to roost as a story that involves everybody. The local efforts that we have can only really work within the parameters of the direction of global change. And, the climate story will be one that writes the narrative in the long term for all of this.
So we need all of these efforts, all at once. Hands-on, long-term, science-driven restoration projects adapted to the specific needs of different ecosystems. But those things won't be enough on their own. We also have to decide, as a global community, if we want to keep burning fossil fuels or if we want to have coral reefs. Because we can't have both.
Reefs are valuable even outside of what they provide to humanity. They're fantastically beautiful, diverse, and unique living structures. I think it would be a terrible indictment on humanity if we didn't do everything in our power to protect them.
Corals are survivors. For hundreds of millions of years, they've been a keystone species, creators of vital habitat that helped our planet transition from desolate silence to cacophonous life. But this wild flourishing didn't have to happen, and there's no guarantee that it will continue. Life on Earth is resilient, but it's not inevitable, and it's not indestructible. This episode of Threshold was written, reported, and produced by me, Amy Martin, with help from Erica Janik and Sam Moore. Music by Todd Sikafus. Post-production by Alan Douches. Fact-checking by Sam Moore. The sounds of coral reefs and the fish you heard in this episode were generously provided by Tim Lammett and the following scientists: Ben Williams, Emma Veshka, Eric Parmentier, Isla Keisha Davidson, and Steve Simpson. Big thanks to all of them. This show is made by Oracle Productions, a nonprofit organization powered by listener donations. Deneen Weisky is our executive director. You can find out more about our show at thresholdpodcast.org.